People ask what cold running feels like from inside the hull. I tell them it feels like holding your breath for 19 days. That is not a metaphor. On a stealth cruiser running full suppression, you do not speak above a whisper. You do not drop a tool. You do not flush a waistline at the wrong interval. Because every system aboard, every thermal vent, every passive coolant bleed, a micro-adjustment in attitude, is timed and sequenced and routed through a suppression schedule that the ship's AI updates every 4 minutes. You live inside a machine that is pretending, with total conviction, to be dead. And you match it. You breathe shallow, you move slow, you eat cold rations because the galley heating elements are offline. You sleep in shifts of 2 hours because longer means deeper breathing, and deeper breathing means warmth, and warmth means a signature, and a signature means the Sovhari find you. We had been running cold in the Keshel Drift for 19 days when they found us anyway. Not us, specifically. They found wreckage. The drift is littered with it. Hulks from the Pale Corridor engagements 3 decades back, civilian transports that misjudged the current, Terran survey vessel that went dark before I was born, and has been drifting in ellipse ever since. The Sovhari caste-fleet knew the drift, patrolled it regularly because their lower castes used it for salvage, and salvage rights under their hierarchy were a point of considerable internal politics. So when their long-range sensors picked up Ian's pale ignition sitting cold and unpowered at the edge of a debris cluster, they catalogued her as a new Hulk. Recent kill, no active transponder, hull configuration consistent with a mid-weight Terran courier that had maybe caught something along the corridor boundary and drifted in. They were wrong about all of it. But they believed it completely, because we needed them to. My name is Rael Koss. I was sensor chief aboard Pale Ignition during the Keshel operation. I am telling this now, 12 years later, because the after-action file was declassified last spring, and because the crew of that ship deserves to have what happened said plainly. By someone who was in the room where it happened. Pale Ignition was not a courier. She was a veteran-class stealth cruiser, one of 4 in the Terran inventory at that time, and the only one assigned to the Keshel sector. She carried 12 suppressed torpedo bays, 4 lateral rail arrays, defense grid, that could track and engage 83 simultaneous inbounds. She massed roughly 4 times what her silhouette suggested, because the veteran class was built around a compression hull frame that folded most of her weapon mass inward and reflected sensor returns, consistent with something much smaller and much less dangerous. She was, in every operational sense, a weapon pretending to be wreckage. That was the design intent. That was always the design intent. Commander Vale Oron had held her cold for 19 days, because the intelligence, sure, said the Sovhari caste-fleet's primary patrol element, 11 hulls, 4 of them command-cast warships, 7 of them lesser salvage escorts, was cycling through the drift on a 17 to 20-day rotation. We needed them inside their own patrol cycle, relaxed, running salvage protocols rather than combat posture, before the operation began, so we waited. On day 19, at 021 station time, their lead Esbatoch escort locked a boarding approach vector onto Pale Ignition's hull. I watched it happen on my passive array. The Sovhari escort, a mid-weight hull the intelligence file called a reclamation class, which meant it was crewed by their 3rd-tier salvage caste. The ones low enough in the hierarchy to be assigned actual physical boarding work, closed to 300 meters and deployed boarding hooks. 4 of them, long magnetic grapples that clamped onto our hull with a vibration I felt through my boots, a low and foreign clang that ran up through the deck plates and then went still. I looked at Commander Oren. She was watching her board. Hands were flat on the console edge, not gripping it, just resting there. The way a person rests when they have decided something, and are waiting for the clock to catch up with the decision. She said quietly, "All stations, stand by, ignition on my mark. 19 days of cold, 19 days of 2-hour sleep shifts and cold rations and whispered communications and the low particular dread of being a warship playing dead while enemy hulls moved around you in the dark. 19 days of the crew of Pale Ignition, holding absolutely still inside a machine that was holding absolutely still, full assembly of steel and personnel, and suppressed reactor output committed to a single sustained act of collective restraint." Oren said, Mark. Pale ignition came alive 4 seconds. There is no other way to describe a Vethran-class braking suppression at full ignition. The reactor went from 12% passive to 104% combat output in 4 seconds. Every weapon bay unsealed simultaneously. The rail arrays cycled to charge with a sound like a power line snapping. Point defense grid spun up and began acquiring targets before the crew had finished exhaling. And from outside, from the perspective of the Sovari reclamation escort, sitting 300 meters off our bow with its boarding hooks clamped to, pale ignition simply erupted. One moment a dead hulk, the next moment a cruiser, fully armed, fully powered, and already tracking. Seconds after Oren called Mark, the 3 sister ships decloaked. Ion's Ferric Solus, Ion's Pale Ruin, and Ion's Chaos Ember had been running cold FUD in the surrounding debris field, at distances between 800 meters and 2 kilometers. They came up in sequence. Ferric Solus first, then Pale Ruin, then Chaos Ember, each one igniting in that same 4-second surge, so that, from the Sovari patrol's perspective, 4 stealth cruisers materialized out of wreckage in the span of 11 seconds. The Sovari caste-fleet's response divided exactly along caste lines. The 7 salvage escorts broke immediately. No consultation, no exchange of signals that we could detect. They simply broke, on 7 separate vectors, accelerating hard toward the drift boundary. The intelligence file had predicted this. Salvage caste had no combat mandate. Their hierarchy did not permit them to engage independently, and their hierarchy also did not permit them to wait for authorization when authorization was not coming fast enough. So they ran, and that was expected. The 4 command caste warships held. They formed up in a tight defensive configuration. The Sovari standard contact posture, which we also knew from the intelligence file, and opened a hailing channel. The channel was on their protocol, their encoding, their frequency. Commander Orun had the translation suite running before they finished transmitting. What they said, stripped of the formal caste honorifics that padded their communications, was this: identify or we engage. Orun identified us. Ship name, Terran registry, hull classification. She gave them everything the treaty framework required. She did not apologize for the cold running, because the treaty framework did not require apology for operating a stealth hull in uncontested space. She did not explain the 19 days, because the Sovari command caste would have found explanation a form of weakness. And Orun had no interest in appearing weak. They engaged anyway. The firefight lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The Sovari command caste warships were not salvage hulls. They were armed, crewed by their warrior tier, and they fought with the kind of disciplined precision that a caste-based hierarchy produces when it assigns its best people to a single function and drills them at that function from birth. They were good. 2 of their 4 warships made it to jump distance and cleared the drift under their own power. The other 2 did not. Pale ignition took damage. A rail strike on her port lateral array put it offline for 6 weeks. Ferric Solus lost 3 crew to a boarding attempt that the command caste warships pressed in the first 90 seconds before they realized they were not going to close the distance. Chaos Ember came through clean. When the last Sovari warship cleared the drift, Commander Orun stood her crew down from combat stations. She did not make a speech. She walked the corridor to the crew, poured herself a coffee from the thermos that someone had started. The moment the suppression protocols lifted and she sat at a table and she drank it, that is what I remember most. 19 days of cold rations, and then the first hot thing, and Orun sitting alone with it while the ship's damage assessment ran in the background, and the crew cleaned up around her. The Sovari filed a formal grievance with the Terran Consolidation Council 11 days later. The council reviewed the incident record and found no treaty violation. The drift was uncontested space. Pale ignition had been operating within her registered parameters. The 4-minute firefight was characterized as a mutual engagement, following refusal to accept lawful identification, which was accurate, and which the Sovari hierarchy knew was accurate, is presumably why the grievance went nowhere. The reclamation escort's boarding hooks were still clamped to our hull when we limped back to the supply station at Kelrath. We had to cut them free with torches. One of the deck crew mounted a section of the grapple casing on the wall of the mess as a souvenir. I looked at that piece of Savari steel every time I ate for the next 8 months. I thought about what it meant that they had walked up to pale ignition in the dark and touched her, certain she was dead. We had been alive the whole time. We had simply been waiting for the right moment to prove it.